Good evening and welcome everybody to the 9th webinar, our local community briefings on the new draft Willoughby Comprehensive LEP and DCP. Tonight's local community briefing is on North Willoughby. My name is Norma Shanky-Williams, and on behalf of Willoughby City Council, I wish to acknowledge the traditional inhabitants of the land on which we stand, the Aboriginal people, their spirits and ancestors. We acknowledge the vital contribution that Indigenous people and cultures have made and still make to the nation we share, Australia. Now, before we get into the business of the webinar, I think it's useful to watch this short video that features Mayor Tanya and Dr. Deborah Deering from the GCC to put the work on the LEP and DCP into context. So cue the video, thank you.
Willoughby is a wonderful place to live. It is a city of diversity with beautiful landscapes, people, and of course our vibrant CBD.
Willoughby is a very diverse place. It has an important centre at Chatswood. It has some really much loved and very successful local centres.
Our residents really value our beautiful bushlands and of course our urban environment and our CBD.
It has a range of housing, quite a number of apartments and also a lot of lower density areas. It has important heritage precincts.
Willoughby City Council is committed to delivering a city that is green, livable, inclusive, connected, prosperous and vibrant. Over the last 5 years, we've engaged with the community to help us develop the local environment plan.
The local environment plan, commonly called the LEP, is the planning instrument which actually sets the framework for future development.
In 2012, we created the local environment plan to help us plan and decide what is built and where in Willoughby.
That's been proposed for change, significant changes. For example, in Chatswood, it is an important commercial place for the whole of the district, and even within Sydney, it has a key role. We want to make sure that's facilitated and expanded into the future. But it's hoped and anticipated that Chatswood will grow to be an even more important commercial centre than it isn't at this point in time. You will see in the LEP some major changes to the heights for commercial buildings and also the introduction of more apartment buildings close to the services around the Chatswood CBD.
It also covers affordable housing, environmental issues and bushfire hazards. The local environment plan outlines subdivision sizes, heights of buildings and the amount of floor space area on which you can build. The plan allocates land for specific purposes through zoning and sets standards for development. It aims to provide jobs and housing growth, more medium and high density living, as well as strengthening the character of our CBD. It will help us design our homes for the future. It helps us guide conservation of cultural heritage as well as protect environmentally sensitive land. It helps us create a better place to live with more trees and connected pathways and cycleways.
We also want to link one green space to the other green space so that it's not just isolated green spaces and recreation opportunities, but they can be a network where they can be readily reached by foot, not needing to take a car. They're opportunities that we need to try to grow into the future. While COVID has thrown up some uncertainty about the pace of change, we do know that cities do grow. Willoughby is a very desirable place in the Greater Sydney area. Sydney is a very desirable city. It will grow into the future.
The plan helps us to set our strategic vision for the future.
Being prepared is important and planning ahead is crucial.
So hopefully you'll have found that a useful introduction to the webinar this evening. And I'll just explain now how the webinar will flow tonight. The presenters this evening are myself, Norma Shanky-Williams. I've introduced myself already. I'll be followed by Nicola Grosskops, who will talk about healthy built environments in Willoughby. She's from our North Sydney Local Health District. And that's a very useful and very informative part of our webinar, I trust you'll find. Then Ian Shillington from the strategic planning team will talk about the particular detail around North Willoughby for the LEP and DCP proposals. And finally, Ian Arnott will talk about more general application of the LEP and DCP as regards North Willoughby. We have two councillors in attendance tonight, Councillors Erickson and Moradian, so welcome to you both. And we have 77 people registered tonight for the webinar, and we were expecting some people in person in the chamber tonight who may yet turn up, I hope. Questions can be submitted at any time in the Q&A function of the Zoom, so I encourage you to do that. And staff will respond this evening if we can to those straightforward questions. If not, we give an undertaking to respond within 10 working days on Have Your Say. We'll take questions at the end of the session, around about 7:15, and we will probably take those mostly from the Zoom, as we don't seem to have anybody in person this evening. If you have any feedback or comments, please put those in the chat area of the Zoom and we can see those comments coming through as we're talking. Cameras, of course, are switched off and microphones are muted to reduce the background noise. As the webinar is being recorded and will be available on Have Your Say, those asking questions in the chamber, if we do get people arriving later, will have their image and voice recorded and publicly broadcast and archived, so they should be aware of that. So the agenda for this evening, I'll provide some strategic planning background to the LEP and DCP work we've been doing and introduce some changes that the state government have also made to zoning names. Then we'll move on to the slide deck section from our colleagues at the North Sydney Local Health District about creating a healthy built environment in Willoughby and introduce Nicola to do that. Then we'll have that detailed section that Ian Shillington will provide about the particulars to do with North Willoughby Local Centre and how the LEP and DCP impacts that particular place. And then more general application of the LEP and DCP as proposed from Ian. And then we'll have time for questions before we close at 7:30. So some of the headline changes that we're proposing in the draft LEP and draft DCP, in particular with the LEP, we're growing Chatswood CBD, which is something I think we're all aware of, in line with the CBD strategy. We're growing the CBD along the rail corridor to the north and south and focusing on keeping a very strong commercial core with some mixed use development along the around the edge of the CBD. We're also looking to increase density in our local centres, of which North Willoughby is one, in line with our local centre strategy, which many of you will be familiar with. That was adopted by Council in 2020, having been publicly exhibited and undergone some intense community engagement work. We're also looking at more height and density in industrial zones to try and stimulate investment and new businesses in our industrial areas, which are considered very important areas for Willoughby. We have some of the last industrial areas on the North Shore, and we look after those very carefully. We're also introducing new design excellence requirements to stimulate a better design outcome for new development in Willoughby. And we're looking at increasing our affordable housing requirement from 4% up to 10%, in line with some feasibility work we did before we completed the draft LEP. We're also trying to manage urban heat impacts and providing controls to address that issue. At the same time, we're trying to align our residential controls with the code SEP, the exempt and complying SEP, so that we can achieve more equity in terms of matters that proposals that are dealt with either under the code SEP or as a DA. And Ian will go into a lot more detail about how that's going to operate into the future if we get the LEP and DCP through as proposed. We're also including our landscaping controls in the LEP, moving them from the DCP, because we believe that landscaping controls are such an important element of Willoughby's character going into the future, and also providing a strong level of biodiversity and protection from urban heat. So landscaping is a very important element of the LEP into the future. In the development control plan, we're strengthening our heritage controls. They're already quite strong, but we wanted to add more detail and strength to those controls. And we're reducing our parking requirements, particularly in railway precincts, such as Chatswood, Artarmon and St Leonard's. So this draft LEP and DCP are on exhibition and all the other collateral material for 12 weeks altogether. And we hope that that will give everybody a solid chance of making a good submission and getting back to us with the feedback, whether you think we've got it right or what needs to be changed or improved. In terms of the process for getting to where we are on exhibition, we have based the draft LEP and DCP on all that strategic planning work you'll be familiar with that we've done in the last 4 or 5 years. And those local strategies have been focused on the CBD in Chatswood, on housing, our local centres, our industrial lands. We've done an integrated transport strategy, and of course the work that was undertaken by the state government involving the 3 local governments involved in St Leonard's Crow's Nest, where the trigger of the new metro station has given rise to growth plans for that area of Willoughby, North Sydney and Lane Cove. So our work has been based on all that good strategic work that's happened already, as well as a local strategic planning statement, which is a document that all councils have been required to produce, setting a 20-year strategic planning horizon for their particular local government area. And we produced ours in 2020. And that document has set the blueprint for the work in the LEP and DCP, drawing on those other strategic plans we'd undertaken. So using all that good strategic planning base, we drafted our LEP planning proposal, and we took it to the local planning panel for advice, and they supported the draft LEP. We reported that to council, who encouraged us to refer it to the DPE for the gateway determination, which allows us to put it on exhibition. And that gateway decision was granted in December 2021, with some requirements that we had to deal with before it went on exhibition. We've now satisfied those gateway requirements, and here we are now on exhibition for the 12 weeks, taking us to the beginning of June. The current LEP that we work to is the Willoughby LEP 2012, which if you've done work in Willoughby, you'll be very familiar with. The work on that LEP started in 2006, and it took 4 years to get to the point of exhibition in 2010. And it was re-exhibited, in fact, in 2012, which is something that might occur with this particular draft LEP too. It finally came into force in 2013, so it's now 9 years old and ready for a refresh and a review. There have in fact been 23 amendments since Gazetted, so it's gone up since the number on the slides in just recent weeks. So this is now a document that has to respond, the new LEP has to respond to the draft, to the North District Plan and our local strategic planning statement. So that's why we've drafted a new LEP to respond to those new objectives and aims in those documents, so that we have a new and relevant and modern LEP. The LSPS I referred to before came out following the issue of the district plans across Sydney. So the North District Plan for Willoughby Council area is the relevant district plan. And it sets, as I said, the 20-year vision with priorities and actions for the whole LGA. It's a very comprehensive document, a very comprehensive strategic document that covers all sorts of targets and aims to do with housing, transport, heritage, livability, waterways, biodiversity, climate change, resilience. There's a lot of work gone into the LSPS, and there are a lot of goals and targets in that document that we're now trying to deliver, at least in part, through the LEP and DCP. So it's been a difficult transition from strategic work to what is effectively a statutory document in the LEP. The basis, as I say, of the draft LEP has been drawn from those conclusions and recommendations in our existing strategies, which have been delivered through extensive community consultation already. So what you will see in the draft LEP will be familiar to you if you've followed or been part of the consultation work we've already done, whether it's under the local centres strategy, under the CBD strategy, under the industrial lands, the Crow's Nest, St Leonard's Crow's Nest 2036 plan, our housing strategy or our transport strategy. All of those have had a part in producing content for our draft LEP and DCP. In addition, it will assist in responding to our new Resilient Willoughby strategy and action plan. And this is a very important document which strives to create resilient places and resilient buildings. The resilient places need to withstand climate change and sustain biodiversity and support vibrant, connected communities. And that's something we're going to hear a little bit about when we hear from Nicola later. The resilient buildings must be safe and well designed and affordable and sustainable. So we need to make sure that the controls we put in our new LEP and DCP deliver on the aspiration of that Resilient Willoughby strategy. In terms of some key statistics that we're basing our work on, you heard Deborah Deering talk in the the introductory video about the fact that COVID had impacted the rate of growth in Sydney, and we have lost people to the regions, we know this. But Sydney will continue to grow, and the population in Willoughby is expected to grow to almost 92,000 by 2036. And of course, we will monitor this demographic change and increase. The number of dwellings is expected to grow to accommodate that new population by over 6,700 new dwellings. So that's the target that we're aiming for in the length of this LEP and the LSPS that underpins the LEP. The 5-year dwelling target we were given under the North District Plan of 1,250 new dwellings between 2016 and 2021 has been met. So now we need to plan for the longer term future, and that's the figure we have of 6,700 new dwellings. And Ian will talk about our housing strategy in that regard later. The number of jobs, very importantly, is also expected to grow to 74,500 by 2036, with a particular jobs target for Chatswood of 6,000 to 8,300 jobs. And we're trying very fervently to deliver on that jobs target in Chatswood, which is why we believe that the commercial core of Chatswood is such an important element of the strategy that we've done for that particular part of the LGA. At the same time as we've been doing our own local strategic work, the state has been making changes and revisions to the state planning framework. And there have been some recent changes to environmental zones, essentially in name only, but it's useful to know that our environmental zones, our E zones, are now conservation zones and are in the LEP already. So zones that you may have been familiar with, like environmental living E4 zones, are now C4 zones, but still called environmental living and largely unchanged apart from that name change. Other zoning changes that are proposed by the state government relate to the employment zones, the industrial IN and business B zones. The existing business and industrial zones are to be replaced with 5 new employment zones and 3 supporting zones under the standard local environmental plans instrument, the standard instrument LEP as we call it for shorthand. So those new zones have collapsed some existing zones into a new zone and made some change to what uses can be undertaken in those zones. So the transition details for that work are on exhibition with Council's draft LEP. That was at the request of the state government, and the outcomes of that exhibition will be reflected in the final LEP. So please have a look at those changes too. They're not merely cosmetic, there are changes to what can occur in different zones, as well as the name changes that the state government want to introduce. So now I'll hand over to Nicola Grosskops, who's from the North Sydney Local Health District, and she will talk about creating a healthy built environment in Willoughby, a very important element of this webinar. Thanks, Nicola.
Thanks very much, Norma. Good evening, and thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Nicola Grosskops, and I'm a public health professional from the Healthy Built Environments team at Northern Sydney Local Health District, which is a part of New South Wales Health. Northern Sydney LHD is part of health, and we work across the 9 local government areas of Sydney's North, one of which is Willoughby Council. The Healthy Built Environments program that I'm from exists to help people improve their health and wellbeing in North Sydney by creating healthier environments, one which support people to be healthy as part of everyday living. The broad banner under which we operate, known as Population Health, focuses on the conditions that enable people and our communities at a population level to remain healthy and out of hospital, which is our end goal. So as we meet here tonight to discuss 2 very important documents that will shape Willoughby and the lives of those who live and work here for many years to come, I thank Council for inviting us to talk about the important connection between the built environment and our health. So by way of background, when I refer to the built environment, what I mean is the human-made spaces in which we live work and play on a daily basis. So our homes, buildings, streets, sidewalks, transport corridors, and so on. In this short presentation, I'm going to provide you with an overview of the connection between the built environment and our health in order to set the context for tonight's webinar and discussion about the draft Willoughby LEP and DCP. So 2 questions for you to think about now and as we move through the presentation tonight, and I encourage you to use the chat function and participate in the discussion via the chat. And the first question is quite simple. What makes you feel healthy? Is it some form of physical activity? Is it eating healthy food? Or is it time spent socialising with family and friends? Is it connecting with nature? I know during COVID that was a really big thing for a lot of people. Or is it spirituality? Or maybe a combination of all these things? And secondly, how does the neighbourhood that you live in contribute to your health and well-being, both positively and negatively? Well, what we know is that all built environments are not created equal, and the environments in which we live have a profound impact on both our physical and our mental health. Healthy built environments support positive health outcomes by making healthy, active lifestyle choices the easier choice. An excellent resource that summarises the many ways in which the built environment interacts with our health is the New South Wales Healthy Built Environment Checklist that's on the screen there. This checklist is based on 11 themes covering healthy eating, physical activity, housing, transport and connectivity, quality employment, community safety and security, open space and natural features, social interaction, social connection and connectivity, the environment and health, and finally, environmental sustainability and climate change. Yeah, great to hear from Linda on the chat that green connection and having Willoughby Park was really essential for her in lockdown for exercise. I'm sure many would agree, Linda. Now, what ties all these themes of a healthy built environment together is the concept of healthy neighbourhood design. And healthy neighbourhood design is facilitated by land use and development decisions, like we're talking about tonight, as informed by documents like the LEP and the DCP. So these prioritise complete, compact and connected communities. Communities that reflect these 3 qualities support both recreational and physical activity along safe, well-connected tree-lined streets and paths. They also facilitate planned and incidental social interaction as people have greater opportunities to meet and at easily accessible destinations like local shops and town centres and areas of green open space. Healthy neighbourhood design also supports business activity and strong local economy, and they connect people with services such as public transport when they do need to travel beyond their local neighbourhood for work or leisure. And this diagram captures these features of a healthy neighbourhood. So you can see a neighbourhood designed around a connected and walkable street network linking to key destinations that are also co-located. So for example, a primary school positioned next to a community centre or a library, as well as nearby retail. And what this does is it reduces the reliance on the motor vehicle for short trips, which in turn reduces local traffic congestion, promotes healthier and more sustainable forms of transport, like walking and cycling, and it encourages people to spend time and builds a stronger sense of community and place there. So there you have an example of how zoning and development controls can facilitate complete, connected and compact communities, and the way in which these communities promote our physical and mental health by encouraging physical activity, opportunities for social connection, and access to healthy food at local shops. Now, a central focus of the draft Willoughby LEP and DCP is housing. And from a health perspective, the research evidence is clear that the healthiest neighbourhoods are typically characterised by a diversity of housing types, with more compact housing, such as apartments and townhouses, located in and near centres, such as the example seen here and in many areas of Willoughby City Council, such as in and around the Chatswood CBD. And the word density can sometimes concern people, but what we know is that higher density housing that is well designed and well located has an important role to play in accommodating future population growth and providing people with more affordable housing options. We know that housing is a fundamental health need, and a diversity of housing types contributes to a diverse community, one in which people of all ages can live and grow over time. Thankfully, through appropriate zoning and best practice development controls, much of our high density housing is setting a new benchmark for design by incorporating green roofs and walls, like you can see in the picture, as well as measures to activate streetscapes, minimise potential negative outcomes such as overshadowing of public spaces. With all this said, as our city becomes more compact, we do have to invest in not just the quantity, but the quality of our public domain, which includes open space. Access to quality open space within walking distance where people live and work is associated with a range of positive health outcomes. For example, time spent in green space reduces the risk of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, premature death, preterm birth, stress, and high blood pressure. And of course, green and natural vegetation contributes to a healthy planet. Which leads me to the final theme of the presentation this evening, environmental sustainability and climate change. These interrelated themes are both major public health issues, and we can design our neighbourhoods in ways that protect our valuable natural habitat and use natural tree shade, design quality built shade to mitigate against urban heat and future-proof our communities against natural hazards and disasters like floods, bushfires and heat waves, which we know are such a localised problem. In 2020, more people died from heat than car accidents, and heat-related deaths in New South Wales account for more deaths than all other natural disasters combined. When we think about these natural hazards and disasters, some of the most vulnerable people in our society, elderly, children and people suffering from chronic disease, are the most at risk. So I hope this presentation has given you some insight into how our environment, I should say, shapes our lifestyles and therefore our health and well-being. The Healthy Built Environment Checklist resource is available on the New South Wales Ministry of Health website if anyone is interested. And I'll just leave you with those two questions from the beginning of the presentation with that context now. What makes you feel healthy? And more importantly, how will the neighbourhood that you live in contribute to your community's health and well-being over the next 15 to 20 years? Thank you, Norma.
Thanks, Nicola. That's always a really good part of the webinar, I think, because it really focuses on what we're trying to do with our LEP and DCP in terms of people's well-being and health and the livability of the whole LGA. So now we're going to hand over to Ian Shillington, and Ian's going to talk through some of the detail around the draft LEP and DCP as it affects North Willoughby. So I'm going to be helping Ian by changing the slides when he requires them. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Norma. Yes, as Norma says, my name's Ian Shillington. I'm a strategic planner working in the strategic planning team at Council, and tonight I'm joining you from home. So my job tonight is to give you an overview of the changes as they relate to North Willoughby as a centre, as a local centre, with the new LEP and DCP currently on exhibition. So a lot of these changes stemmed from the centre's strategy that was adopted by council, a local centre strategy. And in it was the vision for North Willoughby, which I think sums up very well the character that we're trying to achieve here with the changes. Realising that it is a distinct village, it's a distinct centre from separate from the Chatswood CBD and has a lower scale of development compared to the Chatswood CBD, and we're trying to retain that leafy streetscape and attractive communal open spaces into the future. And there's a number of key changes, quite a number of changes in the LEP, in the draft LEP and DCP that relate specifically to North Willoughby. And I'll talk in a bit more detail on those in the next few slides. And essentially they relate to increasing heights on key sites and floor space ratios, creating some new public open space areas, and also changes in the DCP to increase pedestrianisation. So it's about providing more development, but also protecting the character of the area and improving it through more public space opportunities and laneway connections. Next slide, thanks Norma. So the existing zone, as you can see, the North Willoughby local centre there, it's very much centred on Penshurst Street and Victoria Avenue, stretching down to Sydney Street. And you can see there's the existing local centre zone, which is not changing in the new LEP. The only zoning change, there are two zoning changes proposed, and that is, as you can see on that slide there, in Sydney Street there from 202 to 216, to change that from a medium density R3 zone to a local centre zone and increase the height up to 17 metres. And this is to, I guess, relate well to the new open space area that is proposed at 316 Penshurst Street. And that is being proposed to rezone from B2 to RE1, public recreation, and to be acquired by council as a new public open space to enhance that corner. And therefore this new commercial development would directly address that area. And the properties to the south at 302 to 314 Penshurst Street, increased FSR and height of building there as well from 11 metres to 17 metres. Thanks Norma, next slide. As I said, there's quite a lot of detail. I'll take you through some of the main changes. I guess the key focal point of development in the North Willoughby Centre is the corner sites, those corner sites of Victoria Avenue and Penshurst Street. Those four corner sites are proposed to increase from height of building from 15.5 to 20 metres on the northeast corner and the northwest corner, and as well as those other corner sites. So that's a key change. Other sites include down to the south there, 283 to 285 Penshurst Street, the front half of the site to change from 14 metres to 20 metres, with the rear half of the lots to retain the existing height controls. You'll notice that also on some other corner sites that the rear heights will stay at 14 metres. I guess to have that gradation of development away from those key corner sites and to respect the adjoining lower density residential areas. Next slide, thanks, Norma. Another key site is 173 to 197 Victoria Avenue. A reasonably significant height increase proposed there from 12 and 14 metres to 25 metres, with an increased FSR to 2.1 to 1. And I'll talk about that later as well. We're looking at a new public open space as well to incorporate with that development with where the existing parking is. And changing the FSR on 151 to 161 Victoria Avenue from 2 to 1 to 2.8 to 1. It's all about increasing density on key sites within the, within a reasonable scale for that centre that respects the local character, environment, and also at the same time improving the local character through open space areas and pedestrian improvements. Next slide, thanks, Norma. So in terms of active street frontage, which is proposed to be extended where the new commercial area is proposed there in Sydney Street, and also in front of the opposite park that's proposed there on the corner of Sydney Street and Penshurst Street, and extending the active street frontage in Victoria Avenue there along 173 to 197 Victoria Avenue in conjunction with that new development site there of up to 25 metres high. Next slide, please. Thanks, Norma. So as well as the LEP changes that I've just summarised, highlighted, there's also a number of changes in the DCP that specifically apply to North Willoughby as a local centre. And these are outlined in Part L of the DCP. It's intended that these controls and performance criteria will work with the other parts of the DCP. For example, Parts B and D relating to residential and commercial development will also apply to development, but if there's any inconsistency with those parts, the controls under Part L, which is specific to this centre, will prevail for any new development that occurs in this centre. Next slide, thanks, Norma. So the local centres strategy in Part L proposes a number of performance criteria, and this is very much about protecting some existing features and also encouraging new appropriate development. So some of those performance criteria include retaining the fine grain built form of existing shop fronts, ensuring any new development respects the heritage value of the existing Willoughby Hotel, create high amenity retail connections to rear lanes, for example, through to George Brain Lane and Sterling Lane, to maintain the active street frontages that I talked about earlier, to ensure we have active commercial and other types of uses on those actual street frontages to encourage public vitality along those areas, to encourage green roofs and rooftop gardens, and to provide deep soil zones in appropriate locations to support, protect existing trees where that's appropriate, and to support additional mature trees as well, to improve the streetscape and reduce urban heat. Thanks, Norma. Next slide. And again, there's quite a number of detailed principles in the master plan for the centre. And I talked about earlier about new high quality public open spaces and pedestrianisation and traffic calming, which is proposed on the corner of Penshurst and Sydney Street. And those new pedestrian links that I'll show you in the next slide, which will outline those, and pedestrian amenity improvements on the intersection of McMahon Street and Penshurst Street, and curb blisters to improve pedestrian amenity a new public open space in the corner of Royal Street and Victoria Avenue, new shop-top housing development to create open space connectivity and separation between buildings through those new laneways that I mentioned, along with the increase in heights and densities that is proposed. And the height of any new development next to the Willoughby Hotel shall not exceed the eaves height of that heritage item. Next slide, thank you, Norma. So there you can see the master plan, which you can see the new pedestrianisation features proposed at Sydney Street there with the junction of Penrose, Penshurst Street, and the new laneway connections there through to Stirling Lane and George Brain Lane from Penshurst Street. And the new public open space area is also proposed, which I talked about earlier. Thanks, Norma. Next slide. Some of the controls. So the DCP has performance criteria and also controls that would apply to new development proposals. And they go with the, they reflect the heights that are proposed in the LEP. For example, we're talking about 5 stories on the land that's fronting the new public open space there on Sydney Street junction that I talked about earlier, and 6 stories, up to 6 stories for amalgamated lots on the corners of the intersection of Penshurst and Victoria Avenue. Those key sites at the centre of the north, which is the focal point of the North Willoughby town centre. The protection of the Willoughby Hotel, the maximum of 8 stories on that site on the corner of Royal and Penshurst Street, where you've got the existing office works. I think that it's in a pet shop there on that site. But other things also control the impact of development, such as a minimum 3-metre upper level setback above the first 2 stories along Penshurst Street and Victoria Avenue, and also the public domain and open space improvements, as well as the pedestrian improvements in the intersection of McMahon and Penshurst Street. And provide generous laneway pedestrian links to the rear laneways that I talked about earlier, be a minimum of 4 metres wide, and also improving pedestrian connectivity through the centre from Penshurst Street and Victoria Avenue. Thanks, Norma. Next slide. So this is from the local centre's strategy, which sets out you can see the scale of development that's proposed with the blue identifying new commercial development on the ground floor to get that, ensure you get that ground floor activation, and then the shop top housing with the residential above, and you can see the different heights on those key corner sites that I talked about, and the new development fronting that new proposed public open space on the corner of Royal Street and Victoria Avenue, as well as the Sydney Street changes, the pedestrianisation, the new public open space there, and the new height controls there to address that area. You can see there's a couple of photos there as well. You can see on the slide that car park you can see there on the right photo would be a future open space area with underground parking, for example. That's what's shown in that master plan there. And there's a streetscape as well. In the other photo they're showing, you can see the hotel, the Willoughby Hotel, and future development would be reduced to protect the impact, to ensure that integrity of that item, that heritage item, is protected. Thanks, Norma. Next slide. I'll just also talk briefly about a planning proposal which has been considered recently by council in March. It was considered by council, and that's for a site just adjoining the local centre at 92 to 96 Victoria Avenue. So that's just to the east of the local centre. This proposal was supported by council to go through to the next stage of a rezoning, and it's now with the Department of Planning and Environment, waiting on a gateway determination for that to be put on public exhibition. Essentially, the aim would be to increase the density there and allow an additional permitted use of multi-unit housing in what is currently an R2 low density zone. I guess council supported this on the basis that it adjoins the centre and it's sort of sandwiched between the centre and an existing seniors living development to the west. And we're looking at an increase in FSR from to 1:1 from the current 0.4 to 1, an increase in the height, a modest height increase from 8.5 metres to 10 metres to facilitate multi-unit housing between 2 and 3 stories across the site. And also ensuring that the whole site is developed, the 3 blocks are developed as one, being about approximately 2,500 square metres, to ensure that there's no isolation and it's developed in an integrated way. The concept proposal submitted looked at 22 multi-unit housing units, ranging heights between 2 and 3 stories, with landscape areas and building setbacks to Victoria Avenue as well. And the next slide, thanks Norma. So there you can see an overview in those yellow units there in the centre of that slide, show you the proposed multi-unit housing, as I said, ranging between 2 and 3, with the 2 and 3 levels across that site, with the 8 existing seniors living development to the east. And to the west, you've got a footprint there. You can see the eventual development under the changes proposed, so under the LEP and DCP, with the new heights there proposed, with the higher heights, I guess, on Penshurst Street, and reduced heights 3 stories at the rear there. So that puts it in the context of adjoining future development under these proposed LEP, DCP changes. Thanks, Norma. Next slide. I'll just talk briefly about some of the other general LEP improvements. Some of the things we're doing, removing anomalies, a new design excellence clause, and a new urban heat clause, which I'll talk briefly about those in the next slides. Removal of obsolete clauses and updating of state and local land acquisitions, such as road widening and open space. Next slide, thanks, Norma. So the new design excellence clause is aims to achieve the best design outcomes through a process that would happen at the development application stage. And the design excellence clause in the LEP would apply to all the local centres. You can see on that map there, which includes North Willoughby, as well as the Chatswood CBD. In the case of North Willoughby, a design excellence review panel would review and provide advice for future developments within that local centre. The new urban heat clause, I think Nicola talked about urban heat. It's a term that describes the tendency of cities to be much hotter than surrounding areas, for example, through dark roofs and hard surfaces, which can absorb and retain heat. So council is proposing a new clause to apply to new development, with the object being that new development incorporates effective design and ongoing operation to reduce and remove heat from the environment and protect community health and well-being. Council's local strategic planning statement includes an action to encourage the use of cool building materials in any new development, which could be achieved through colours and the types of materials that are used, as well as design features such as eaves and where windows are located, and where appropriate integrating water features, both natural and man-made, into urban design. So the new urban heat clause is to ensure that new development incorporates effective design and ongoing operation to reduce and remove urban heating from the environment and protect community health and well-being. So it's very much about protecting, making a more pleasant environment for people in the future, both within the buildings and in the open space areas next to those buildings. Here's an example of one of the anomalies that's been corrected, proposed to be corrected. That's at 256 Victoria Avenue, Chatswood. I think it's with the mixed development, I think, is located on that site. We're probably familiar with that. So there it's intended to amend the LEP boundary, the heritage map, to update, to reflect the location of the existing heritage item after the completion of the recent surrounding development that's happened on that site. It's just one example of one of the anomalies being corrected in the new LEP. Next slide, thanks, Norma.
I think this is where we hand over to Ian, probably.
Yes, I'll pass you over to Ian Arnott.
Thanks very much, Ian. That was really good. Great to get into the detail of that particular local centre. And now hand over to Ian Arnott.
Thanks very much, Norma and Ian, for that presentation. That's great. And Nicola for previously as well. Tonight I'm focusing mainly on housing, so outside really of the local centre primarily, and for those surrounding residential areas. If you've been to any of the previous webinars, you may well have seen the slides that I'm about to present. So in 2020, Council adopted our Willoughby housing strategy in response to the state government requiring a housing strategy to be put in place by each council and demonstrating how targets for housing would be achieved. And that was based on projected population growth for our area, and a requirement for us based on that population growth determined that we believed we'd need in the order of 6,700 new dwellings. So to provide those, the housing strategy proposes the 3 focus areas of around the Chatswood CBD, where the bulk of that housing growth would occur. In the local centres, such as the North Willoughby local centre, and in our existing residential flat zones. And that's for probably two main reasons. One is because those places are the most accessible to public transport and services and retail outlets and jobs. And so it encourages people to use active and public transport means rather than increasing car usage and clogging up our roads. It's also to protect our lower density residential areas. We see the value of our low density suburbs in the Willoughby local government area and the benefit and diversity of housing that they provide. And for that reason, it was that being one of the reasons why the focus areas were seeking not to intrude further into those low density areas. So the main changes proposed are to align the for our low density areas where the state government complying development policy applies for dwelling houses, to align generally with those controls. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. It's in order to provide a level of equity. There's one exception to that, and that's the landscaping control. And we see it as a very important characteristic of our area, our garden suburbs and the open space around the built form and the opportunity for canopy tree growth. And so for that reason, not only are we retaining our own controls in respect to landscaping for single dwelling houses, but also strengthening them by moving them from the development control plan into the local environmental plan. And similarly with dual occupancy, we're seeking to align with the code SEP, the state government code SEP, and again with the exception of landscaping. Just point out that the code SEP for these types of development don't apply in conservation areas, heritage conservation areas, or to the C4 environmental living zone, where a high level of environmental value is in place. Also, the state government has introduced manor house control, which if council doesn't have its own minimum lot size for manor house development being up to 4 dwellings and up to 2 stories on the one site. If council doesn't have a minimum lot size, these can be done under complying development on a 600 square metre site. And for that reason, council has seen fit, in terms of the draft LEP, are recommending to increase that minimum lot size to 1,100 square metres, that being consistent with all other residential flat development. We see that as important for a number of reasons. One is to get the maximum dwelling capacity from these residential flat zones in order to meet our targets, and also for the amenity available. If each individual site at 600 square metres is developed, it generally is likely to detract from amenity, with dwellings more likely to be looking into each other over side boundaries. In respect to those that exempt and complying development code, if you aren't familiar with it, that means an application can be approved without reference to council. As long as it meets a ticker box standard, there is no merit assessment involved in complying development. As long as it meets the numerical controls, a private certifier can issue approval for those developments. And so council is seeking to see, for the purpose of equity, whether aligning with those controls is appropriate. So just in respect to dwelling houses, you can see from the 2 photos on the left-hand side of the page, these are examples of dwelling houses that have been approved under the complying development framework, and the 2 on the right, or the 2 photos on the right, under a development application. And you can see, at least from a streetscape perspective, the scale of those developments is not dissimilar. I just want to have a look at these tables and indicate to you what I'm meaning by changing to the complying development control. So the table on the left is our current local environmental plan control, which is expressed as a floor space ratio, but in the 3rd column in that table indicates what the gross floor area control results in from that ratio. So if you go to the 3rd line down, you can see for a 400 square metre site, you can achieve 200 square metres of floor space. However, if you go to the line below that, for a 401 square metre site, the amount of floor space you get reduces to 188.5. So it doesn't continually increase with the increase in site area. Under the complying development control, it does, by applying the gross floor area control, it does result in a continual increase as your site area grows. I would point out also, however, and our example coming up will demonstrate this, that the gross floor area under the complying development is significantly greater than under our current control. Sorry, not this slide, one coming up in a minute. Just in respect to landscaping, this is indicating the table on the left, indicating our current development control plan control, which we propose to be incorporated into the draft LEP. As I said before, strengthening our ability to enforce that control, although also limiting to some extent the flexibility of applying that control. So we're very interested in your feedback on your thoughts on that. As I said, we do see the value of keeping our landscaped areas, and particularly in order to achieve an increased canopy cover in our area to address the urban heat effects and also to maintain and improve the characters of our suburbs. The table on the right-hand side is showing the landscape control under the complying development code. And you can see in all instances, council's control is greater than that of the code SEP control. So here's just an example of a site area of 650 square metres, in which a floor space ratio under our current local environmental plan of 279 square metres is achievable. Under the code SEP and under our draft LEP, 335 square metres is achievable. So quite a significant increase in floor space achievable there. In this particular instance, 312 square metres was proposed and approved for this site. In respect to landscaped area, under our development control plan and under what would be incorporated to the draft LEP, 266 square metres of landscaped area would be required. Under the code SEP, 195 square metres, so quite a considerable amount less. And in this instance, 255 square metres was provided. So quite close to what our control is and would be. Just going to move on to dual occupancy, which we're also seeking to align with the code SEP. I just want to make it clear that the reason for this is that for both the dwelling houses and for dual occupancy, that at the moment someone can come and build a dual occupancy under the code SEP at significantly greater scale than our local environmental controls require. However, and so if they are non-compliant in one small component for, with the code SEP, they would be forced into the DA process. That would mean that what they can achieve on their site is significantly less than what could be achieved under the code SEP requirements on the site next door, for example. So just in respect to dual occupancy, the four main types of dual occupancy: on the top left-hand corner, attached side by side; the top right-hand corner, attached one above the other; the bottom left-hand corner, detached, both with a street frontage. And in this instance, the two street frontages, it's a corner site, that's a corner site. And in the bottom right-hand corner, detached in a battle axe formation. Under the code SEP, the first three forms of dual occupancy can be approved under a complying development certificate, but the fourth type, the battle axe form, is not permissible under the code SEP. Under our current control, it is a permissible form, but we're proposing to remove it as a permissible form under the draft under the draft LEP. And you can see in this example, at least, that battle axe form is and commonly intrudes into that backyard zone. So when we say the value of our landscaping and our landscaped areas, the loss of that backyard zone has a real impact on that, and an impact on the ability for canopy tree growth, and also impact on the surrounding backyards of neighbours in manners such as outlook, bulk, overshadowing, privacy, those sorts of things. So we're looking to prohibit battle axe form of dual occupancy. We are looking to align with the floor space controls though, which are shown there and will be clearer in an example coming up in a minute. And in terms of the landscape controls, similarly incorporating into the local environmental plan, but to actually increase the provision to align with what our dwelling house controls require. At the moment, dual occupancy requires 35% landscaped area for a dual occupancy. We're saying that as these dual occupancies are permissible in the same areas that dwelling houses are, the same landscaping control should apply. The other thing that the code SEP allows is for subdivision of a dual occupancy immediately, whereas our current local environmental plan requires 5 years after construction before they can be subdivided. We're proposing again to align with the code SEP in that respect and allow for immediate subdivision. So here's an example. We are not proposing to change the minimum lot size for dual occupancies, which under our controls is 700 square metres for attached and 900 square metres for detached. In this instance, it's an attached side-by-side dual occupancy that has a 730 square metre lot size or site area and was approved under the local environmental plan at 292 square metre floor space, which was right at the maximum permissible. Under the code SEP and what we're proposing under the draft LEP, 482 square metres would be achievable. So you can see that's a significant increase in floor space, albeit that they can now do that irrespective of what council does under the code SEP. If it's in an area that the code SEP applies, they can come and do a dual occupancy at that much larger floor space ratio. The landscaped area currently under our DCP, Development Control Plan, requires 255 square metres. In this instance, 311 was provided. Under the code SEP, 265 is required, so slightly higher than our current standard. However, we're proposing under the draft LEP to align the landscaping control with our dwelling house landscaping control. And in this instance, that would require 308 square metres. I just mention that we have done testing, some testing of both these dual occupancy and dwelling house controls as to whether the floor space and the landscaping can be achievable, and we've determined that it can, albeit with the result that more at an upper level would be necessary to achieve the floor space permissible. Again, I repeat that that's already the case under the code SEP, that floor space control. This is just another example pointing out for a detached dual occupancy. And in this instance, you can see the floor space is 385 under our current LEP. Under the draft LEP would permit 541. However, the landscaping would be significantly greater than both our existing development control plan and the code SEP requirement. Just moving on to manor houses, and this is what I mentioned earlier, that if council does have a minimum lot size control for manor houses in their LEP, that's what applies to a complying development proposal. If they don't, a minimum lot size of 600 square metres applies. We propose to incorporate a minimum lot size of 1,100, being consistent with our minimum lot size for all other forms of residential flat development. And affordable housing, our current affordable housing control is 4% of the residential floor space in development, in new developments, that being in addition to the permissible floor space on the site. Under our local strategic planning statement, there was a commitment to increase that 4% to 7% by 2021 and 10% by 2026. To bring these changes into effect takes time, and we've obviously passed the 2021 date. And so we're proposing to jump directly to the 10%. However, that 10% would be contained within the permissible floor space, not in addition to. The reason we're proposing that is that the permissible floor space on a site is largely derived from the bulk and scale of development achievable. If you determine a floor space based on that bulk and scale and then add to it by adding on the affordable housing, then the original objective of bulk and scale is lost. So we're proposing to incorporate that affordable housing provision within the permissible floor space. A feasibility report by SGS Planning and Economics has been done in respect to the affordable housing. It doesn't indicate that in all instances the 10% is achievable. That is available for consideration in conjunction with the exhibition, and we're interested again in your feedback on those things, noting the need for affordable housing, but the feasibility that in some instances wouldn't be able to achieve that 10%. Just a quick overview of the development control plan, and it's divided into 12 parts, which we've largely tried to focus on the type of development being proposed, so limiting where you have to jump around the document to some extent at least. So we have sought to make it a more user-friendly document. It's still quite large because the development control plan is the supporting document to the local environmental plan and contains those more detailed controls within it. If you were proposing residential development, you would go to Part B of the development control plan, which divides it into minor and major development, minor being the low density development of single dwellings, dual occupancy, and the major being residential flat shop top housing development, that form. In the R2 zone and similarly in the C4 environmental living zone, which is actually contained in Part C of the draft DCP, the landscape controls have been taken from the DCP and placed in the LEP, as I've mentioned a number of times. For the C4 zone, we're also looking for additional documentation around impacts on bushland where you're adjoining such areas or places of potential Aboriginal significance. For our heritage conservation areas, we believe the conservation controls have worked well for Willoughby. We are trying to just clarify and improve them in some part. Where there is a building within a heritage conservation area that contributes to the significance of the conservation area, council obviously doesn't want to see those buildings removed. We hold quite a high standard of what needs to be provided to demonstrate or justify demolition where the building contributes to the significance of the conservation area. That's what we do presently, although it's not explicit in our development control plan what sort of documents such as structural engineers reports that would be required if demolition of a contributory item was proposed. So we've incorporated that into this draft development control plan. We've also incorporated controls in respect to semi-detached development, which are missing from the DCP at the moment, and also just reinforcing the importance of protecting the external fabric and streetscape character. In respect to the residential flat development or shop-top housing development, we're generally aligning with the state government apartment design guide, and where there's inconsistency, our existing controls would remain. And we're also incorporating some deep soil planting controls. So if you're proposing development in the local centre of North Willoughby, for example, or any of our local centres, then you would refer to Part B for the residential component of the development. That should read Part D for the commercial component. Part L is a new section of the development control plan, which is the place-based controls. And Ian spoke earlier about those controls, which are largely coming from our local centre strategy and the adopted strategy controls for the North Willoughby area. It may be necessary for either residential or commercial shop-top housing forms of development to refer to these other sections of the development control plan as well. We're seeking to apply a travel demand management where discourages car ownership and car usage, particularly with residential flat or commercial development where they're in close proximity to transport, public transport. In terms of vegetation management, Part G, there were changes done to this section in 2020, and there's few further changes proposed. Water management, similarly in 2019, changes were adopted, and there are only minor changes there just to provide a bit better clarification of some of the provisions. And no change to Part J, building sustainability, which was adopted in 2020. And I think we're moving on to questions now, and I think we've had some questions coming through in the chat, and we'll seek to answer what we can. And if we don't answer them tonight, we will be providing written answers over the next 10 days, I think.
That's right, Ian, absolutely. And so we've got Andrew, who's been monitoring the questions coming through tonight. So I wonder if you can provide us with some of those. Start with the first question, Andrew.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Norma. I'll just start with one of the later questions because it related to Ian's presentation. It's from Bob Taffel. Oh, sorry, no, this one's from Kate Lamb. Could Ian please paraphrase Council's objectives, re-housing changes, /code, /current, /proposed provisions, re-floor space and landscaping? Is he saying greater floor space is being tolerated, but not ever at the expense of landscaping /deep soil?
I think that's a good summary, Kate. Yes, greater floor space is already tolerated because of the state government controls under the complying development step, although that to some extent is at the sacrifice of landscaping and deep soil zones. And we, whilst we are aligning with the floor space, we see the importance of retaining our landscaping. So I think your summary was good.
Thanks, Andrew. Is there another question?
Yeah, there's a lot actually, Norma.
Lovely.
I'll start again with just one of the last questions because it can be answered quite quickly. So this one is from Bob Taffel. It's, what is the estimated date that the new LEP DCP will be gazetted?
Well, that's a very difficult question that Bob's posed to us because we don't hold all the levers to finalising this process, of course. Much of it rests on in the power of state government and the Parliamentary Council's office. So we're hopeful that if there are very few changes, but I'm not sure that that will be the case to the draft LEP and DCP, we can take it to Council in October and make the plan by the end of the year. But if there are quite significant changes, which is probably more likely depending on the feedback we get, then we'll probably run into another period of exhibition, and it could be next year, middle of next year, 23, before we get the plan made. So hopefully that's given you some indication of our timeline. Thanks, Andrew. Another question?
Yeah, so I'll just go back to the earliest questions that we said we'd answer live. So this one was from Roy McCullough. It was just after the New South Wales Health presentation. So yeah, it's great presentation. Can you talk to the impact that quality, well-located housing has on our community's health? And yeah, hopefully you, Norma, or Ian could talk a little bit about
Yes,
that.
for sure. That's from Councillor McCullough, I'm assuming. Thank you, Councillor. Well-designed, well-built, well-located housing is critical, I think, for the health and well-being of our community. Places that are not expensive to run, easy to maintain, got good access to open space and public transport, and other services and amenities as required is critical. But in brownfield established areas, you can't completely redesign an area. So what you're trying to do is improve what you've got and plan better for the future, which is why our housing strategy tends to locate new housing in areas that are already well served by transport and services, as well as open space. Actually, in Willoughby, we've got a pretty good record for access to open space, or at least green networks to get to open space. So we're actually one of the better served councils, but we can't rest on our laurels. We have to make sure that that is improved into the future as our population diversifies and increases. So the location of housing is very important, and our housing strategy talks about the importance of housing close to services and close to transport, so that people don't have to spend a fortune on commuting and getting to the places they need to get to. So do you want to add to that, Ian?
No, I think Nicola did that presentation is great in demonstrating the importance of that location in and around transport nodes and having all of those things easily accessible.
I agree. Good presentation. Thanks, Andrew.
Of course, this presentation will be available from tomorrow as well on our website, if people will want to go back over it.
That's true.
Yep. So the next question is from Mario Nicotra. What about plans for parking facilities for all this increased development that will affect George Brain Lane?
Could I just ask you to repeat that question? Sorry, Andrew.
Yep. So what about plans for parking facilities for all this increased development that will affect George Brain Lane?
So well, parking will be required in the context of new development. That, you know, there are currently development control plan requirements around parking, and as I said, we will continue to have controls for provision of parking in respect to new development. However, where it's in highly accessible locations, it may be that those controls are not as strong as the current control, not requiring as many car parking as the current controls require, because of that accessibility and the desire to encourage people to use the public transport available and to active transport by walking to the services and shops that they have at hand. I'm not sure if your question is about the access along George Brain Lane and whether that access would be improved. I think there are currently widening proposals for George Brain Lane that would continue to apply, but I would have to check on that, and maybe we can answer that in the written form.
And if you are referring particularly to the planning proposal that Ian Shillington talked about in George Brain Lane, then that will, once Gateway has been provided by state government, will go on public exhibition. So there'll be an opportunity to comment on the parking requirements at that stage before the matter gets reported to council.
Yeah, sorry, I might have missed the question there.
Maybe that's what it was about. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
And I'll just, on that similar topic, there was a question just more recently from Anna. She asked, does travel demand management involve reducing available parking associated with new multi-dwelling developments?
Yes, it does. I mean, that's the point of travel demand management is to encourage the use of active transport in preference to the private vehicle. And that means using, nearby trains and buses rather than defaulting to the private vehicle. So more cars equals more congestion. And this is a way of managing travel demand by reducing the amount of parking available at destinations for people to encourage them to make a different choice of travel.
All right,
In fact,
Norma.
Andrew, you may be in a good position being our strategic transport planner to add anything you might want at that point.
Yeah, I think you've pretty much said it, Norma. It's, recognising that, most people still own cars and Sydney is a very car dependent city, but in locations that are close to good public transport links, there is scope for less parking in developments to take advantage of that accessibility. So another question here from Kate Lamb. So I like the laneway treatments. Are developments responsible for this directly or through developer contributions?
It's generally, if it's on public land, there would generally be requirement for upgrading in accordance with the strategy, but it may be sought that is offset by things such as planning agreements or contributions. Do you want to add it? That covers it?
It'll be a collaborative exercise between the developer and council to achieve the aim of the strategy to get that laneway activation going. So through development applications, we'll achieve the outcomes we want, we hope. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah. The next question is somewhat related. It's from M. So with the new LEP, will there be also a revised / new developer contributions Section 94 plan?
Well, that's referring back to the old clause in the old Act. It's no longer Section 94, of course, it's Sections 711 and 712. We have our local infrastructure contributions plan here in Willoughby that was endorsed by Council in 2019, and there's no current demand for that to be revised at the moment. It will be, maybe when it's 5 years old, we might have another look at it, particularly in light of the state revisions to the rules around developer contributions that have been in the press recently, and which council have been somewhat unhappy with in terms of the constraints on council to collect developer contributions. So there may be we may be coerced into revising our local infrastructure contributions plan, but there's certainly, it's not on the agenda to do that in line with the LEP. That's not part of the programme, if that's the question. We might take just one more because we've just past 7:30, I think. So if there's one more, Andrew, thank you.
Yeah, so this one also relates to the laneways. It's from M. Does council have a vision for the rear laneways? Do they have a preference for laneways to be used for service vehicles only, or combined active uses by cafes, retail and service deliveries?
Second, yeah, certainly it's more of an active vision we have for the laneways, so that it's more attractive and appealing and provides an area people can relax in away from the main roads rather than just service vehicles. But there may have to be shared access. We appreciate that there will still need to be rear lane access to service businesses. But at the same time, in many parts of the world, and indeed, parts of Sydney, these things can co-function, and you can create a much more attractive area for local residents and visitors to enjoy away from the main road, and something to discover, if you like, at the back of a centre. So maybe that's enough questions for now, Andrew, sorry, because we've now passed 7:30. So it remains just to thank you this evening for tuning into our webinar and explain the next steps, which is a bit of a repetition from one of the questions I think Bob Tappel asked about the process going forward. We're on exhibition until the 7th of June. So that's quite a nice extensive period for you to consider submissions you might want to make to us. And these webinars are being focused on local areas. So tonight was the 9th and we're doing 12 altogether. The feedback today will go into a feedback report, and we'll take that report to council in, we think, October or thereabouts, to suggest any amendments to the draft LEP and DCP, and maybe to suggest there needs to be a second exhibition. We'll have to wait and see what the tone and nature of that feedback is. And then we expect either to make the plan optimistically by the end of this year, or more realistically by the middle of next year is our timing. So the webinar, as Ian mentioned before, will be on the Have Your Say site tomorrow. You can hear all this again tomorrow. And you can look at the slide deck if you don't want to hear our sweet voices talking over it. You can look at that separately. It remains just to say thank you very much for tuning in. We appreciate your interest in the work we're doing, and we hope that you'll decide to make a submission and let us know what your response is to this work. And thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you. Thanks.